Had you ever noticed how the most intelligent people you know often prefer to be alone? Not because they're antisocial, not because they can't connect with others, but because they've discovered something about human nature that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. They've realized that solitude isn't loneliness, it's freedom. Arthur Schopenhauer, one of history's most penetrating philosophers, understood this better than almost anyone. He spent most of his life deliberately choosing solitude over society. And from that choice came insights about human intelligence, creativity, and the nature of consciousness that are still shocking people today. But here's what makes Schopenhauer's approach to solitude so unsettling, so terrifying to most people. He didn't retreat from the world because he was damaged, bitter, or incapable of forming relationships. He withdrew because he was intelligent enough to see through the illusions that keep most people desperately clinging to social validation, group thinking, and the exhausting performance of fitting in. This is the uncomfortable truth. People don't fear solitude because it is painful in itself. They fear solitude because it removes the mask. Without the noise of constant interaction, without the mirrors of other people's approval or judgment, you are forced to face your own consciousness directly. And that confrontation is something most people spend their lives avoiding. Schopenhauer discovered something radical. The people who choose to be alone aren't running away from intelligence, they're running toward it. While everyone else is busy conforming, compromising, and dulling their minds with constant social noise, the truly intelligent are doing something far more dangerous. They are thinking. Now, let's be clear, this is not a celebration of antisocial behavior. This is not an excuse for bitterness or misanthropy. Rather, it is an invitation to understand why some of the most brilliant minds in history, philosophers, inventors, scientists, artists, consistently chose solitude as the foundation of their greatest work. Solitude, for them, was not a rejection of life, but a deeper embrace of it. Schopenhauer wrote, "A man can be himself only so long as he is alone." And what he meant by that is profound. The moment you need other people to tell you who you are, what to think, or how to feel, you've already surrendered the most extraordinary human gift, the ability to think independently. Think about it. How much of what you believe is actually yours? How many of your opinions were formed from genuine reflection versus being absorbed from your family, your friends, your culture, the media, or the group you most identify with? If you are honest, you will find that most of your inner world has been colonized by other minds. This is why solitude becomes essential. It is the only space in which you can separate what is truly your own from what is merely borrowed. And this is why the most intelligent people often step away from the crowd, not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. Schopenhauer understood something frightening about groups. The moment you are in one, even if it's just two people, you are no longer thinking with your full mind. Part of your brain is engaged in monitoring social dynamics, avoiding conflict, seeking approval, or trying to maintain harmony. Your intelligence is split. Your thoughts are no longer free, they are edited, softened, reshaped to fit the invisible boundaries of social interaction. This isn't conscious, it's evolutionary. Human beings are social animals, and our brains have been wired for survival within groups. That wiring is so deep that even in casual conversation, your capacity for independent thought is reduced. You become less original, less creative, less willing to pursue uncomfortable truths. You censor yourself without even realizing it. And here's the tragedy. Most people live their entire lives in this state. From family obligations to work environments, from friendships to endless entertainment, they are never truly alone with their thoughts. They never experience their full intelligence because they never dare to sit in silence long enough to hear it. The intelligent person, however, makes a radical decision. They decide that access to their own mind is more valuable than social approval. They choose solitude not because they hate people, but because they love truth more. And they know that truth, more often than not, only reveals itself in silence. Watch closely how intelligent people behave in groups. They often appear slightly detached. Not because they don't care, but because part of their mind is always observing, analyzing the subtle manipulations at play. They see how group thinking emerges, how individuals suppress their insights in order to belong, how conformity replaces honesty. And they quietly decide that the price of belonging is too high. This doesn't mean they cannot collaborate or connect deeply. In fact, when they do engage, their relationships are often more authentic because they are not built on dependency or performance. They don't need constant validation, so when they give attention, it is genuine. When they speak, it is honest. When they listen, it is with presence. But this kind of clarity frightens people. Why? Because someone who is not dependent on social approval is uncontrollable. A person content in solitude is not easily manipulated. They do not need your acceptance, your praise, or your permission. They are free. And freedom, to those still enslaved by validation, looks terrifying. Schopenhauer himself lived this truth to its extreme. He avoided much of society, preferring long walks, solitary reading, and relentless reflection. And though he lived a life many would call lonely, his ideas shaped generations of thinkers, writers, and psychologists. His solitude was not a retreat from life, but a laboratory for understanding it. The lesson is not that we should all abandon society. Rather, it is that we must learn to balance it with solitude. Without solitude, you never fully encounter yourself. Without silence, you never discover the depth of your own mind. Without the courage to stand apart, you will always be defined by the crowd. So, the next time you see someone who seems content to be alone, don't mistake it for weakness or social failure. Look closer. You may be witnessing a form of strength that most people will never develop. A strength born not of rejection, but of independence. A strength that comes from valuing truth above approval, clarity above comfort, and intelligence above conformity. The truth is, solitude terrifies us because it strips away illusion. It demands that we face the raw reality of who we are without the comforting mirrors of other people's eyes. And yet, for those willing to endure that confrontation, solitude offers something no amount of social approval can ever replace: freedom of thought, originality of mind, and the unshakable courage to be oneself. Perhaps this is what Schopenhauer wanted us to see. That solitude is not a prison, but a path to deeper intelligence, to self-understanding, to a kind of independence that makes you untouchable by the shallow games of conformity. And though few will walk that path, those who do might just find that what they discover in silence is not emptiness, but the very thing the world needs most: truth. The art of being alone without being lonely. Second insight. They've discovered what Schopenhauer called the art of being alone without being lonely, a level of inner development that most people never attempt. There's a profound difference between someone who is alone because they can't connect with others and someone who chooses to be alone because they've developed the capacity for a rich internal experience. The former experiences isolation as deprivation, the latter experiences it as liberation. This distinction is at the heart of Schopenhauer's philosophy of solitude, and it's also what makes those who embrace it appear so mysterious, even unsettling, to others. Schopenhauer himself spent decades cultivating what he described in the world as representation, the ability to generate entire landscapes of thought, imagination, and insight within one's own consciousness. He didn't require external entertainment, shallow chatter, or constant stimulation to feel alive. His inner world provided endless fascination. Most people, however, are strangers to this inner richness. They can't stand silence. They fill every empty moment with noise, television, social media, gossip, distraction. Why? Because when they're alone, they're confronted with their own emptiness. Solitude forces them to face what they've neglected within themselves: undeveloped thoughts, unexamined fears, a lack of genuine curiosity. To them, solitude feels like punishment. But for those who've cultivated their minds, solitude feels like luxury. The intelligent person who embraces solitude discovers something radical. Their own consciousness, properly developed, is more captivating than most social interactions, more rewarding than most forms of entertainment, and more enduring than external validation. Their private inner dialogue becomes a source of joy rather than torment. This doesn't happen by accident. It requires discipline, what Schopenhauer called the cultivation of the mind. Such people read deeply instead of consuming shallow information. They reflect systematically instead of reacting impulsively. They refine their taste in art, literature, music, and philosophy until they can extract meaning where others see only boredom. They create work that springs from genuine inner necessity rather than from the demand for applause. Slowly, they transform their inner world into a realm so abundant, so endlessly engaging, that solitude no longer feels like emptiness, it feels like home. In this sense, they are never truly alone. When they read, they enter into dialogue with the greatest minds of history, philosophers, poets, scientists, and visionaries who still live through the pages they left behind. A single afternoon with a book can feel like a council of sages, offering centuries of distilled thought in silence. When they reflect, they converse with dimensions of their own psyche that most people never meet, voices buried beneath layers of distraction and noise. When they create, they give form to something the world has never seen before, a fragment of truth or beauty that could not have existed without their private devotion to thought. Hours pass without the ache of loneliness, because their solitude is not barren. It is populated by ideas, insights, and questions far more compelling than the shallow stimulation of small talk or the trivialities of a trial. Social media. This is why intelligent solitude unnerves others. A person who can sit happily in silence radiates a kind of self-sufficiency that feels threatening. Their contentment challenges the unspoken assumption that happiness must be constantly fed by external stimulation, approval, or company. Their peace of mind exposes the poverty of those who cannot survive even a single evening without a screen, a crowd, or a distraction to shield them from themselves. The courage of intellectual independence, Schopenhauer's third insight, is crucial here. Intelligent, solitary people develop what he called intellectual independence, the courage to think thoughts that have never been thought before, precisely because they are not constantly cross-checking their ideas against the consensus of the group. Most of humanity never achieves this independence. Our thoughts are rarely our own. We inherit our opinions, our tastes, even our emotional reflexes. Culture teaches us what is admirable and what is shameful. Family imprints upon us what is possible and what is forbidden. Peers enforce the boundaries of acceptable behavior and belief. The media tells us what to care about today, what to fear tomorrow, and what to forget next week. We like what others like. We believe what our group believes. We repeat what we've heard without examining it. And we mistake this mimicry for thinking. But the solitary thinker makes a terrifying discovery. The very presence of other people alters how you think. The moment you enter a group to your mind begins to shift. Subtle forces take over. Part of you manages impressions, part of you avoids conflict, part of you searches for approval, and part of you adapts to the group's unspoken norms. This is not a flaw in character, it is evolutionary design. The human brain evolved not for originality but for cohesion, for survival within tribes. Radical independence was once dangerous, conformity meant safety, which is why true originality requires solitude. When you are alone, your mind can wander into forbidden territory. You can ask questions that would be ridiculed in conversation. You can entertain curiosities that seem useless, or chase an idea far beyond the point where most people would stop. You can pursue strange, unsettling, or dazzling thoughts without fear of rejection. This is the soil where genius grows. History is proof. Newton's laws of motion, Darwin's theory of evolution, Einstein's relativity, Schopenhauer's own philosophy, all were born in solitude, nurtured in the silence where thought could unfold without interference. None of these insights would have survived a committee meeting or been approved by a focus group. They were too strange, too disruptive, too daring. Only the patient silence of solitude gave them room to grow. This is why intelligent people protect their solitude. It is not misanthropy, it is preservation. They know their most valuable contribution to the world will not come from echoing what everyone already thinks, but from following the faint and fragile threads of thought that appear only in silence. But this path demands immense courage. To think independently is to step into an intellectual wilderness with no guarantee of success and no promise of validation. You may spend years exploring an idea that no one else understands. You may be dismissed as eccentric, irrelevant, or insane. Yet intelligent people who embrace solitude accept this risk because they know it is the only path to true originality. Their reward is not merely personal insight, but the possibility of offering the world something it didn't even know it needed, a new way of seeing, a deeper form of truth, an idea capable of shifting the course of history. And here lies the paradox. Those who appear to withdraw from humanity and solitude are often the very ones who end up giving humanity its greatest gifts. The economics of attention, Schopenhauer's fourth insight, expands this further. He believed that solitude is not only about independence, but about resource management, what he called the economics of attention. To Schopenhauer, attention was not an infinite resource to be squandered on trivialities. It was the very essence of intellectual life. Mental energy, he argued, was finite, fragile, and easily scattered by noise, both literal and social. Every unnecessary demand on one's attention drains the fuel required for deep thought, creativity, and philosophical vision. Intelligent people who choose solitude understand this with a visceral clarity. They realize that social interaction, though it may appear harmless or even pleasant, carries hidden costs. Every conversation requires more than words. It involves decoding subtle shifts in tone, tracking emotional undercurrents, negotiating unspoken agendas, and engaging in the constant, invisible calculations of human dynamics. To most people, this expenditure of energy is simply the price of belonging. But to the solitary thinker, it feels like bleeding away intellectual capital. They see clearly that the human mind has only so much bandwidth each day. To scatter it across gossip, small talk, or endless social performances is to diminish its ability to focus on what truly matters: thinking, creating, solving, imagining, and building. They would rather conserve their energy for pursuits of genuine substance than dissipate it into obligations that leave nothing behind but fatigue. To some, this looks cold, even inhuman. The refusal to constantly socialize, to join in rituals of small talk, or to be endlessly available can appear arrogant or detached. But what these solitary individuals are protecting is nothing less than their creative capacity, the very instrument through which they can make meaningful contributions to the world. They regard intellectual energy as a sacred currency, and they spend it with great care. This is not withdrawal from life, but an intentional investment in life's highest possibilities. Where others trade their attention for distraction, the solitary invest theirs into building something enduring. Where others dissipate their days in endless chatter, the solitary concentrates energy into thought, into art, into truth. And so, their solitude, far from being empty, becomes a forge. In the silence they guard so carefully, attention sharpens, thought deepens, and imagination flowers. What they eventually bring forth, whether in philosophy, science, art, or innovation, often transforms the very society that once misunderstood their withdrawal. Thus, the solitary thinker embodies a paradox of the heart of human progress. By stepping away from the crowd, they return with gifts that elevate the crowd. By refusing to scatter their attention, they preserve the power to create ideas that illuminate, challenge, and endure. For Schopenhauer, this was not a luxury, but a necessity. Only those who master the economics of attention, who dare to protect their solitude, and who cultivate independence of thought, can access the kind of intelligence that reshapes the world. And so, solitude, far from being an escape, is the very condition of originality. Their social life, therefore, tends to be minimal, but intentional. They maintain only a small circle of relationships that enrich rather than deplete them, friendships grounded in mutual respect and an understanding of their need for space. For them, connection is not about quantity, but quality. One or two genuine bonds are worth infinitely more than 100 shallow ties. They avoid the scatter of casual networking, superficial gatherings, and empty entertainments. They prefer the quiet companionship of solitude, punctuated by rare but meaningful connections, the kind that leave them nourished rather than drained. Schopenhauer himself modeled this principle with striking clarity. He would walk alone for hours, dine in silence, and retreat to the solitude of his study for entire seasons. To outsiders, he appeared antisocial, eccentric, perhaps even bitter. But what those observers missed was that his retreat preserved his mind for what he valued most: philosophy. His legacy, still studied centuries later, was not the byproduct of endless social activity, but the fruit of rigorous self-chosen solitude. The intelligent, solitary person follows this same path, whether consciously inspired by philosophers like Schopenhauer or simply guided by instinct. They recognize that depth is worth infinitely more than breadth, quality more than quantity, substance more than popularity. They choose solitude not out of misanthropy, but as a calculated strategy to safeguard the one resource that cannot be replenished once spent: attention. The economics of attention, for Schopenhauer, was the most precious currency a human being possesses. To squander it on noise, gossip, or trivial obligations was to waste the very essence of one's intellectual life. The solitary person understands this with a visceral clarity. They know that every interaction, even the most casual, demands far more than the exchange of words. It requires emotional attunement, subtle negotiation of tone, the management of impressions, and the navigation of hidden agendas. Most people pay this cost unconsciously, chalking it up as the price of belonging. But the solitary thinker experiences it as a depletion, as if their inner reserves are quietly siphoned away. By minimizing these expenditures, they protect the energy required for genuine creation, discovery, and reflection. To outsiders, this looks cold, perhaps even inhuman. But what they are protecting is nothing less than their creative capacity, the very instrument through which they can contribute something of real value to the world. For them, attention is a sacred currency, and every choice about where to place it becomes a moral decision. Philosophical vision, this brings us to Schopenhauer's fifth insight. Those who embrace solitude often develop what he called philosophical vision. When you step outside the endless stream of human chatter, something remarkable begins to happen. You acquire distance. Distance from the immediate, from the urgent, from the endless stream of trivial crises that dominate the public mind. With this distance comes clarity. From solitude, patterns emerge. You notice that what most people treat as urgent emergencies are often recycled dramas, the same fears, the same rivalries, the same insecurities dressed in slightly different costumes. You begin to see that the machinery of human life is powered not by reason, but by unconscious drives: envy, ambition, vanity, fear. Whether in families, workplaces, or nations, the psychological engines are the same. The stage changes, the actors change, but the underlying play is eerily familiar. This perspective is liberating, but also isolating. It liberates because it strips away illusions. You are no longer compelled to take every social demand or cultural fashion at face value. You see through the games. But this clarity also sets you apart, because once you perceive these truths, you cannot immerse yourself in them as others do. The unconscious immersion that makes social life easy is no longer available. You play the game perhaps, but you know it is only a game. Society as theatre for the intelligent solitary, human society begins to look less like a noble arena and more like a theatre of illusions. People rush about in frantic pursuit of validation, wealth, or recognition, never pausing to question the machinery driving them. To see this clearly is not to despise humanity, it is to understand it. But understanding separates. Schopenhauer wrote often of the suffering inherent in existence, the way most people live as captives to unconscious forces rather than masters of their own minds. The solitary person withdraws not because they hate others, but because they cannot continue to pretend that these illusions are as significant as society insists. To them, solitude is not rejectionite, is alignment with truth. Not superior, but different. This philosophical vision does not make them superior, but it does make them different. They trade the comfort of easy belonging for the clarity of honest observation. They may still engage with society, but they do so selectively, and always with awareness. They participate when it serves a purpose, but they no longer require approval to feel whole. Here lies Schopenhauer's most profound observation about solitude. Those who choose it are not turning their backs on humanity. On the contrary, they are preserving the very conditions under which humanity's highest capacities can flourish. Solitude as cultivation, creativity, wisdom, original thought, and genuine insight rarely arise from the noise of constant company. They require silence, patience, and long hours of uninterrupted reflection. Solitude, then, is not escape, it is cultivation. It is not withdrawal, it is preparation. The solitary individual emerges from silence not diminished but strengthened. They engage the world from a place of depth rather than surface, authenticity rather than performance, contribution rather than consumption. While most people are exhausted by the demands of social conformity, the solitary person returns to the world with originality, something society cannot generate on its own. Schopenhauer believed that those who embrace solitude are often humanity's greatest benefactors. Their insights, works, and creations transform the world not because they remained immersed in its noise, but because they dared to step away long enough to hear the subtler truths hidden beneath it. Thus, solitude is not a rejection of life, but its highest expression. It is the conscious decision to spend one's most precious energy not chasing fleeting validation, but cultivating what endures, understanding, wisdom, and the power of thought. They're not running away from human connection. They're developing something valuable to bring to human connection when they choose to engage. The truly intelligent person understands that their greatest contributions to others won't come from constant availability or endless social accommodation. They will come from the depths of insight, creativity, and wisdom that can only be cultivated in the quiet workshop of solitude. Most people misunderstand solitude because they see it only in terms of absence of company, absence of activity, absence of validation. But for the individual who embraces it deliberately, solitude is not emptiness, it is presence. It is the presence of one's own thoughts, one's inner richness, one's ability to construct meaning without leaning on the noise of the crowd. Schopenhauer understood this distinction with extraordinary clarity. He saw that those who can face themselves without distraction inevitably develop a different order of intelligence, one that society often finds both inspiring and unsettling. This is why Schopenhauer found people who choose solitude not just intelligent, but terrifyingly so. They've discovered something that threatens the entire social structure most people depend on: the discovery that true power comes from inner self-sufficiency. To the ordinary person, meaning, purpose, and even identity are outsourced, shaped by family, peers, institutions, and culture. But the solitary thinker reclaims that power. They learn that the mind, properly cultivated, can generate insight and purpose independent of external validation. Such independence destabilizes the very assumptions upon which social conformity rests. And so, when you encounter someone who is genuinely content being alone, your discomfort isn't just social conditioning, it's recognition. On some level, you sense that they have accessed a realm of consciousness you haven't. They have a relationship with their inner life that frees them from the fragile approval loops most people live within. They are not desperate for belonging because they already belong to themselves. The person who chooses solitude is not antisocial. They are not fleeing intimacy, nor are they damaged or afraid. Quite the opposite, they have chosen a more demanding path, one that requires courage. It is no easy task to sit with your own mind without distraction, to wrestle with your own doubts, to cultivate patience and discipline in the absence of external encouragement. But through this discipline, they reach levels of originality and self-knowledge that social life, with all its constant chatter and conformity, rarely allows. And this is what makes them terrifyingly intelligent. Not only can they think original thoughts, they dare to follow them, even when those thoughts lead away from social approval, into territories of understanding that most people find too lonely or too strange. Explore. They prioritize truth over comfort, depth over popularity, and meaning over distraction. The next time you meet someone who seems deeply content in their solitude, who needs no constant stimulation, who finds endless fascination in their own inner world, remember Schopenhauer's insight. You may be standing before someone who has touched forms of intelligence that emerge only in silence, insights that arise only in solitude, and wisdom that develops only when the mind is free from the constant pull of other minds. They're not running away from intelligence, they're running toward it. And what they find in that solitude may be exactly the kind of truth the world most desperately needs.